The house at the edge of the Appalachian ridge had a way of swallowing sound, as if the mountains themselves leaned closer to listen. Every Thanksgiving, smoke rose from chimneys across the valley everywhere except that house. Locals said the walls didn't like fire, that the rooms preferred cold. On the morning of November 28, 1974, 3 sisters crossed its threshold anyway, carrying pies wrapped in foil and years of silence between them. Their laughter felt out of place, thin and nervous, like voices spoken in a church after dark. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and something older, something trapped. The floorboards groaned under their steps, not from age, but as if responding. Windows watched the woods instead of the sky, and the dining table was already set, dusty plates aligned with unsettling care. No one remembered placing them there. Outside, clouds thickened, pressing low against the hills, promising snow that would bury the road before nightfall. As daylight faded, the house grew restless. Walls clicked softly, like teeth. A radio in the kitchen turned itself on, spilling out a warped hymn before dying in static. The sisters tried to ignore it, tried to pretend the house wasn't listening as old arguments surfaced, as regrets slipped into the room with the cold. Somewhere above them, footsteps traced slow, deliberate circles, though no one had gone upstairs. Dinner was served at sunset. 3 plates. 3 chairs. When one sister rose to fetch more gravy, the lights flickered once, and when they steadied, her chair sat empty. The food on her plate was still warm. No scream followed. No footsteps ran. Only the steady ticking of a clock that hadn't worked in years. By morning, the snow lay smooth and untouched around the house. The door stood closed. Inside, the table remained set for 3, waiting patiently, as it had every Thanksgiving before. The isolated Appalachian house earned its reputation long before the sisters returned, not through violence or visible decay, but through an absence so complete it unsettled anyone who came near it. Silence in the mountains was common, but this was different. It did not feel natural or peaceful. It pressed inward, heavy and deliberate, as if sound itself were unwelcome. During holidays, when nearby cabins echoed with music, prayer, and clattering dishes, the house remained mute. No laughter escaped its windows. No smoke rose from its chimney. Even animals avoided the yard, skirting the property line as if sensing an invisible boundary they were unwilling to cross. Locals whispered that the silence had started decades earlier, after a Thanksgiving that ended without explanation. Neighbors claimed they heard singing that night, followed by a sudden cut, like a wire being snapped. From that year onward, every holiday brought the same eerie stillness. Snow fell more thickly around the house. Winds died at its doorstep. Bells tied to porch rails never rang. Those who dared approach reported an odd sensation in their ears, as though pressure were building, as though the house were drawing noise out of the world and keeping it for itself. What frightened people most was not what they heard, but what they didn't. Doors didn't creak. Floorboards didn't groan. Even footsteps seemed to vanish once they crossed the threshold. Hunters passing nearby said their radios failed. Children claimed their voices sounded distant when they shouted toward the house, like echoes swallowed before returning. On Thanksgiving especially, the silence deepened, becoming absolute by sundown, thick enough to feel against the skin. Over time, the house became a warning passed quietly between families. Stay away during the holidays. Don't linger after dark. If you hear nothing at all, turn back. Silence was no longer just emptiness, it was presence. It suggested that something inside the house was listening, waiting for voices, for movement, for life to disturb the stillness it guarded so carefully. The house did not announce danger. It did not threaten. It simply removed sound, memory, and warmth, leaving behind a void that felt intentional, patient, and hungry. The 3 sisters had not planned to return together, and certainly not for Thanksgiving. Years of distance had stretched between them, shaped by old arguments, unspoken blame, and the kind of silence that grows louder with time. The decision came suddenly, sparked by a letter found among their late mother's belongings, a simple note urging them to come home one last time and remember who they were before everything went wrong. None of them admitted how uneasy the idea made them feel, how the name of the house alone stirred memories they preferred buried. Their arrival was quiet and unceremonious. One by one, Their cars pulled into the gravel drive, engines cutting off as if reluctant to disturb the stillness. The house looked smaller than they remembered, yet heavier, crouched against the mountain like it had settled deeper into the earth. Paint peeled from the siding, and the porch sagged slightly, but nothing appeared broken or abandoned. It was as though the house had been waiting, preserved in a state between neglect and care, holding its breath for their return. Each sister carried a different reason for coming back. The eldest sought closure, believing time had dulled the house's hold on her. The middle sister returned out of obligation, convinced that confronting the past was the only way to escape it. The youngest came reluctantly, driven by curiosity more than courage, wanting to see if the stories she'd heard growing up were exaggerated or true. Together, they unlocked the door with a key kept for decades, surprised by how easily it turned. Inside, familiarity clashed with unease. The furniture remained arranged as it always had been, yet something felt wrong, as if the rooms were slightly misaligned with memory. Family photographs lined the walls, their faces watching as the sisters moved through the space, footsteps soft, voices lowered without conscious effort. They spoke politely at first, exchanging updates about their lives, avoiding the heavier topics that hung in the air like smoke. Thanksgiving was meant to be a gesture of reconciliation, a symbolic attempt to reclaim something lost. They unpacked food, planned the meal, and tried to laugh like they once had, but every sound seemed muted, absorbed by the walls. Beneath their careful civility, tension simmered, fed by the knowledge that this house had witnessed their worst moments. Returning together reopened old wounds, stirred resentment, and awakened memories the sisters had never truly escaped, memories that the house seemed eager to welcome back. The warnings began before the sisters even reached the house, delivered in lowered voices and lingering stares from people who recognized the family name. At the last gas station before the road narrowed into the mountains, the attendant hesitated when asked for directions, then quietly told them not to stay overnight. He said Thanksgiving night was different, that the valley changed after dark, and that no one who valued their peace lingered near that house once midnight passed. His words were not dramatic or threatening, which made them more unsettling, as if he were repeating a rule everyone else already understood. As they drove deeper into the hills, more signs appeared. A neighbor standing by a fence refused to meet their eyes and shook his head when he saw where they were headed. An elderly woman outside a small church crossed herself as the car passed, whispering something the sisters could not hear. None of these people tried to stop them outright. They simply warned, as though fulfilling an obligation, offering the same message in different forms: leave before midnight, or don't come at all. According to local stories, Thanksgiving night marked a boundary the house did not like crossed. People claimed lights flickered inside even when no one lived there, and shadows moved through the windows long after dusk. Those who had dared to approach after midnight spoke of doors that would not open, of clocks that froze at 12, of an overwhelming pressure in the air that made breathing feel deliberate and heavy. Some said the house grew warmer the later it became, despite the cold outside, as if something inside were waking. The sisters listened, but distance had made the stories feel unreal, like folklore shaped by boredom and fear. They told themselves the warnings were exaggerations, fueled by superstition and the valley's isolation. Still, the repetition gnawed at them. Midnight was mentioned too often, spoken with too much certainty to be coincidence. Even skeptics could sense that this time mattered, that it represented a point of no return the locals had learned to respect. As evening approached, the sisters noticed how quiet the area became. Cars stopped passing on the road. Lights in distant homes went dark earlier than expected. Church bells rang once and then fell silent. It felt as though the entire valley were preparing for something, retreating inward and leaving the house alone with the coming night. By the time the sky deepened into black and the wind died down, the sisters understood that the warnings were not meant to frighten them away, but to give them a chance to leave while leaving was still possible. The longer the sisters stayed inside the house, the more it began to feel aware of them, not in an obvious or dramatic way, but through small, unsettling details that suggested memory rather than chance. It started with objects that appeared where none of them remembered placing them. A childhood teacup sat on the kitchen counter, cracked exactly as it had been decades earlier. A shawl belonging to their mother was draped over a chair, still carrying the faint scent of lavender and dust. Each discovery stirred unease, because these were not random items, but pieces of their past chosen with precision. As they moved from room to room, the house seemed to guide them, drawing them toward spaces heavy with unfinished history. The hallway mirror reflected them slightly wrong, their faces lagging a fraction of a second behind their movements. In the parlor, floorboards creaked only beneath certain spots, as if marking places where arguments had once erupted, where tears had fallen, where secrets had been spoken too loudly. The sisters felt it then, a growing sense that the house wasn't just old, it was attentive, cataloguing their reactions, feeding on their discomfort. Their conversations began to change. Memories surfaced without invitation, triggered by nothing more than a shadow or a familiar sound. The eldest remembered the night she threatened to leave and never return. The middle sister recalled accusations she never apologized for. The youngest felt the weight of things she'd been too young to understand but old enough to sense. Each memory arrived paired with a subtle response from the house, a door closing softly on its own, a window rattling despite the still air, a light dimming at the exact moment a voice faltered. They realized then that the house didn't merely contain their past, it actively preserved it. It had held on to their guilt, their resentment, their fear, storing it patiently over the years. The walls felt closer, the ceilings lower, as though the structure itself were leaning in to listen. Even silence became loaded, thick with expectation, pressing against their ears and chests. What frightened them most was the feeling of recognition. The house knew them individually, responded differently to each presence, offering comfort to one while unsettling another. It did not judge or threaten. It simply reflected what they brought inside, amplifying emotions they had buried for years. In that realization, the sisters understood that returning together had awakened something deeply familiar to the house, something it had been waiting to feel again. The snow began as a quiet suggestion, thin flakes drifting lazily from a sky that had looked harmless an hour earlier. At first, the sisters barely noticed it, too occupied with the strange atmosphere inside the house. But as dusk settled in, the snowfall thickened, transforming from decoration into warning. The mountains disappeared behind a white curtain, and the trees beyond the windows blurred into pale, motionless shapes. By the time they stepped onto the porch to look, the air had grown sharp and heavy, carrying the unmistakable promise that this storm was not passing through quickly. The only road leading out of the valley twisted tightly along the ridge, narrow even in good weather. Within minutes, it vanished beneath accumulating snow. The sisters watched as wind pushed drifts across the gravel, erasing tire tracks as if no one had ever arrived. Cell phones showed no signal, their screens reflecting back pale, distorted versions of their faces. The radio offered nothing but static, a low hiss that felt intentional, like interference rather than failure. The outside world was retreating, folding itself away and leaving the house sealed inside its own white silence. As darkness fell, the storm intensified with unsettling speed. Snow struck the windows in uneven bursts, not violent enough to sound dangerous, yet persistent enough to feel deliberate. The wind did not howl or roar, it pressed steadily, as if applying pressure from all sides. Every attempt to open the door met resistance, the handle stiff, the frame groaning as though the house itself were bracing against escape. It became clear that leaving was no longer a choice but a missed opportunity. The isolation altered the sisters' behavior almost immediately. Conversations shortened. Movement slowed. Each of them began to listen more carefully, not just to the storm, but to the house beneath it. Without the possibility of outside interruption, every sound inside felt magnified. Footsteps echoed longer. Breathing felt louder. Even thoughts seemed to linger uncomfortably in the air. The storm had not only cut off the road, it had stripped away the illusion of safety that came from knowing help was nearby. What unsettled them most was the timing. The storm arrived exactly as the warnings had predicted, tightening its grip as the evening deepened. It felt less like weather and more like a closing hand, sealing them inside at the precise moment the house seemed most alert. With the road gone and the valley erased beneath snow, the sisters were no longer visitors who could leave at will, but occupants bound to the house until it decided otherwise. As the night pressed on and escape became impossible, the sisters found that the house no longer needed subtlety to draw the truth from them. The isolation created by the storm stripped away distractions, leaving only the past they had avoided for years. Conversations that had once been carefully steered toward safe topics began to fracture, slipping into accusations disguised as memories. Small remarks carried the weight of old resentments, and silences stretched long enough to invite what had been left unsaid to surface on its own. It started with blame. The eldest spoke of responsibility, of sacrifices she claimed no one else understood. The middle sister pushed back, her voice sharp with bitterness, reminding them all of promises broken and choices made without her consent. The youngest listened at first, but the house seemed to lean toward her, encouraging her to speak, and when she did, her words carried a raw honesty that unsettled the others. She talked about fear, about growing up surrounded by tension she could never name, about feeling shaped by something dark long before she understood it. With each confession, the atmosphere inside the house shifted. The air grew warmer, thicker, as if absorbing the emotion being released. Shadows deepened in corners where none should have existed. The sisters began to realize that their shared guilt was not just emotional weight, but something the house recognized and responded to. Blood ties mattered here. Regret carried more power than anger. The house seemed to thrive on the unspoken contracts of family, on loyalty twisted into obligation and love warped by secrecy. Fragments of their childhood returned with disturbing clarity. They remembered locked doors explained away as caution, arguments that ended too abruptly, holidays that felt tense without obvious reason. Certain rooms felt heavier now, almost oppressive, and standing in them brought flashes of memory none of them wanted to claim. The house was not creating these secrets, it was revealing them, pulling them from the sisters the way damp seeps through old walls. The realization settled slowly and painfully that the house had been shaped by their family long before this night. It had learned from them, grown accustomed to their silence, their guilt, their unwillingness to confront what had been wrong. Now, reunited under one roof, those buried truths gave the house strength. It fed on the shared history they carried in their blood, amplifying it, binding them tighter together even as it drove them apart, turning family itself into a source of dread rather than comfort. As the house grew bolder, its presence announced itself through sound, or what passed for sound within walls that seemed to swallow echoes. It began late in the evening, just after the sisters noticed a narrow door at the end of the upstairs hallway, one they were certain had never been there before. The handle was cold, unyielding, and when they tried to open it, the door refused to move, as if fused into the frame. Moments later, a low noise drifted through the corridor, subtle enough to be mistaken for wind, yet too rhythmic to ignore. The sounds did not follow the logic of a living house. They rose from behind walls, from beneath the floor, from spaces that should have been solid. Scraping, shuffling, the faint suggestion of breath pressed close to the other side of wood and plaster. When one sister placed her ear against the wall, the noise stopped immediately, only to resume from somewhere else, as if responding to her attention. The house was no longer merely listening. It was playing with distance, with expectation, teaching them that nothing inside it stayed fixed. They searched for explanations, convincing themselves there must be hidden crawl spaces or forgotten rooms, remnants of poor construction or old renovations. Yet the blueprints they found in a dusty drawer contradicted what they were hearing. There were no rooms where the sounds came from, no passages beneath certain sections of floor. Still, footsteps traced slow paths above the ceiling beams, stopping directly overhead, lingering long enough to raise goosebumps on their arms. The noises grew more deliberate as the night deepened. A single knock echoed from inside a wall, followed by a pause, then another knock, spaced too evenly to be random. Something dragged itself behind the pantry, though the door opened onto empty shelves. From behind the sealed attic hatch came the faint creak of weight shifting, as if someone were sitting just beyond reach, waiting patiently. Every sound carried intention, a sense of awareness that stripped away any remaining belief in coincidence. Fear changed the sisters' movements. They avoided certain hallways, spoke only in whispers, flinched at the smallest disturbance. The house seemed to notice this too, adjusting, drawing the sounds closer when they huddled together, louder when one strayed from the others. It was as though the sealed spaces were not empty at all, but occupied by something confined, something restless, something that had learned long ago how to make itself known without ever fully revealing itself. The disappearance happened so quietly that at first the sisters didn't recognize it as loss. One moment, all three were gathered in the dining room, the table cluttered with half-served dishes and cooling food, the air tense with everything that had been said and everything still hanging unsaid. The next, there was a subtle shift, a gap where a presence should have been. No sound marked it. No door slammed. No footsteps retreated down a hallway. Silence simply rearranged itself. It was the youngest who noticed first, glancing toward the empty chair with a faint frown, certain the middle sister had only stepped into the kitchen. A plate sat in front of the chair, gravy still glistening, steam rising faintly from mashed potatoes that hadn't yet cooled. Her napkin lay folded beside the fork, untouched since she'd stood up moments earlier. They called her name once, then again, voices low, careful, as if loud sound might provoke the house into something worse. They searched the nearby rooms, moving together at first, then reluctantly splitting apart. The kitchen showed no sign of her. The bathroom was empty, the light still off. Upstairs, the narrow hallway felt tighter than before, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. Her bedroom door stood open, the bed perfectly made, undisturbed. It was as though she had never left the dining room at all, as though she had been erased between one breath and the next. Panic rose slowly, heavy and disorienting. The sisters retraced their steps again and again, counting doors, checking corners, opening closets that smelled of old wood and dust. Each failed search deepened the dread, because there were no signs of struggle, no clues to follow. The house offered nothing back. It absorbed their fear without reaction, its silence unbroken. What made it unbearable was the warmth of the plate. The food should have cooled by then. The chair should have been empty and cold. Instead, everything suggested presence, recent and undeniable, while the person herself was gone. The house had not chased her. It had not dragged her away. It had simply taken her, seamlessly, efficiently, without disrupting the rhythm of the room. As the sisters stood frozen in the dining room, the clock on the wall ticked loudly for the first time that night, each second stretching thin and sharp. The remaining two felt the house settle around them, satisfied, as if a balance had been struck. Whatever had been waiting behind the walls had finally claimed something it wanted, and it had done so without needing to announce itself at all. After the disappearance, the house began to change in ways that defied logic, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Hallways seemed longer than they had been minutes earlier, stretching just enough to make familiar distances feel wrong. Doors no longer opened to the rooms the sisters expected. A pantry led into a narrow passage that curved slightly, ending at a blank wall. A bedroom door opened onto the top of the staircase, though that staircase had been at the other end of the hall all evening. The house was no longer a fixed structure but a shifting maze, quietly rearranging itself around the two remaining sisters. They tried to stay together, gripping each other's sleeves as they moved, afraid that even a few steps of separation might be enough for the house to claim another. But the rooms seemed intent on pulling them apart. Corners appeared where none should exist. Walls narrowed, forcing them to move single file. At one point, the eldest turned back to speak, only to find the hallway behind her had sealed itself into a solid, unbroken surface, cutting off the way they had come. Panic sharpened their senses. They memorized landmarks that no longer stayed in place. The sound of their own breathing echoed strangely, bouncing from directions that made no sense. When they ran, the floor softened underfoot, absorbing the impact of each step, slowing them just enough to feel deliberate. Every attempt to reach the front door ended in failure, the house redirecting them toward deeper, darker spaces, rooms with low ceilings and no windows where the air felt thick and watchful. The sisters began to understand that the house wasn't trapping them randomly. It responded to fear, to urgency, tightening its paths when they rushed, loosening them when despair set in. It learned quickly, adjusting with every movement, every whispered plan. Their shared history, once a bond, now worked against them. The house knew how they would react, how they would hesitate, how guilt and loyalty would shape their choices. Time lost meaning inside the shifting rooms. The clock was gone. Light sources flickered or vanished entirely. At one point, they found the dining room again, unchanged, the missing sister's plate still warm, as if mocking their efforts. When they turned away, the room dissolved behind them, replaced by a narrow staircase descending into darkness they hadn't seen before. The house no longer needed to hide its intent. It closed in openly, confidently, reshaping itself to ensure there would be no straight path, no familiar exit, no safe place to wait. The remaining sisters were no longer guests or intruders. They were pieces being moved, guided deeper into a structure that had decided exactly where it wanted them to end up. By morning, the valley was silent once again, blanketed in snow so deep that even the smallest footprints had been erased. From the outside, the house appeared unchanged, stoic against the morning light, its windows reflecting the pale winter sky. Nothing suggested that anything had happened inside, no broken doors, no scattered furniture, no signs of struggle or panic. The smoke-free chimney, the still-closed shutters, the neatly aligned porch boards all conspired to make the house look as though it had been untouched for decades. To any observer, it was simply another abandoned home in the Appalachians, waiting for a curious visitor who might never arrive. Inside, the dining room table remained set for three. The plates glimmered faintly in the dim morning light, remnants of food still warm as though waiting for someone to return. Napkins lay folded beside the silverware, untouched. Chairs sat in their precise positions, each angled as if anticipating the return of someone long gone. The air smelled faintly of old wood, of cold smoke, and something else, something indefinable, lingering like a memory too sharp to ignore yet too distant to name. Every object appeared perfectly ordinary, yet the room radiated a presence, a quiet knowing that no one could ignore. The silence was heavier than before. It pressed in on the walls, thick and patient, carrying the weight of a house that had consumed what it wanted and returned to stillness. Outside, the storm had stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving the valley empty, untouched, as if the world itself had paused to let the house settle into its completion. The snow reflected light evenly, hiding any sign of human struggle, erasing the night's terror beneath a pristine white surface. Even birds avoided the branches near the roof, and the distant wind carried no sound, only a soft, pervasive hush. It was impossible to tell from the exterior what had occurred, and inside, the house offered no explanation. Nothing moved, nothing shifted, and yet everything had changed. The absence of the sisters was total, absolute, as if the house had absorbed them into its walls and floors, leaving only echoes that could be felt rather than heard. The house waited patiently, having achieved its purpose. Its appetite had been satisfied for the moment, and it would not act again until it chose, until someone stepped across its threshold, bringing curiosity, fear, or guilt once more. To the casual observer, the house was simply a house. To those who knew its history, it was a vessel of memory, of secrets, and of a quiet, unyielding hunger that demanded acknowledgement, even in the light of day.